Welcome to the Writing Instruction video series. I'm Tiffany Griffith, Director of Writing at the University of Evansville. This video will focus on sentence parts, the things that build to add to and create a complete sentence, and how to avoid sentence fragments. Now, the following video and the two that follow it work together to form a more complete discussion of coordination and subordination and comma usage and comma errors. So it might be helpful to look at all of them together. That being said, the content of this video might seem very much like a review of things that you learned in grade school. It might seem fairly easy, but it's important to pay attention because, again, everything builds on these principles and the difficulty level will pick up quickly, so it's a good idea to pay attention. Should also point out that although grammar is not the most important part of writing, it is something that's crucial insofar as it impacts the clarity of your writing. Good grammar can improve the clarity and precision of what you're saying, and also, for better or worse, sometimes certain audiences will make judgments based upon the grammar in a piece of writing. If there are a lot of grammar errors, particularly that detract from the author's clarity, then it might be more difficult for your audience to take you seriously, and it could negatively impact your credibility. So, to start with, we'll begin with the very basic building blocks of the sentence: subjects and verbs, and how these work to make complete sentences or independent clauses. Again, a lot of this is going to be review, but pay close attention because the difficulty level will pick up as we progress. First of all, what goes into a complete sentence? A complete sentence is also called a main clause or an independent clause. And in order to have a complete sentence, you must have a subject and a verb. And in addition to these, or these must work together to create, a complete thought. So, your subject is the subject. It's what the sentence is about. The verb, or the predicate, focusing on predicates first, is the action and the object of the sentence, or whatever is receiving the action. So let's take a look at a sample. The boy had been snarling at the dog. We'll divide this into the subject and the predicate. The subject is the boy. The predicate is had been snarling at the dog. For the purposes of our discussion, we really don't need to deal with complete predicates, which is again the verb and the recipient of the action. So we'll just focus on the complete verb. So in this sentence, again, the subject is boy, and the simple complete verb is simply the action, and all parts of the verb that work to indicate tense. In this case, had been snarling. First of all, it might be easiest when you're working with sentence to simply identify the subjects and the verbs. The subject is one or more words telling who or what the sentence is going to be about, or in some cases, who is performing the action in a sentence. The verb is the action, one or more words telling what is happening, what the subject does, how the subject exists. Verbs are different from subjects in that verbs can do a lot more. Verbs can change tenses to show past, present, or future action. For example, the wombat ate the cheese, past tense. The wombat eats the cheese, present tense. The wombat will eat the cheese, future tense. And there are a few other tenses as well. You might say the wombat had been eating the cheese. The wombat will be eating the cheese, and so on. It's important to be careful because in some cases, depending upon how they're used, verbs can also function as subjects. For example, fishing is fun. Chasing his tail is the dog's favorite pastime. These are instances in which something that's usually a verb, fishing, chasing, is actually doing the job of the subject of the sentence. And there are many different types of verbs. Primarily, we deal with action verbs, things like fly, levitate, spelunk, drive, meditate. But we also have linking verbs such as was, were, be, and is, and also helping verbs, should, am, had, will, and are. Sentences can also have more than one verb, just as they might have more than one subject. Sentences that have more than one verb are said to have a compound predicate, as in this example. Anton groomed the ferrets and made sure that they didn't steal anything. In this case, Anton, our subject, did two things. He groomed the ferrets and made sure that they didn't steal anything. Again, this is an example of a compound predicate. one subject with two or more verbs. While it might be easiest to find the verbs first, you still have to find your subject eventually. Remember, the subject is who or what the sentence is about. There might be one subject, there might be multiple subjects. So you might look for your verb first, which could be easier, and then ask who or what is doing the action, who or what is in a state of being, who or what is the subject of this sentence. And finding the verb can be helpful when you're dealing with trickier situations. And let's look at a couple of examples of those, potentially troublesome sentences. First of all, sentences with an inverted order. Your typical order for sentences is subject, verb, and possibly an object. For example, my brother goes to school in Vermont. Brother is our subject, it's at the beginning, goes is our verb. Questions provide perhaps the best examples of sentences with an inverted order. Do you want to go to the zoo? Well, we have in this case our subject sandwiched in the middle of the two parts of the verb, do want. So you do want to go to the zoo. So when you have a question, your word order gets shaken up a little bit. Are you too cold in here? Are is our verb. We know we have to have a subject somewhere, and sure enough, there it is right after the verb. Are you too cold in here? In some cases, you might also have what's called an understood subject. If you say, do your homework, there's no subject actually present visibly in the sentence. When you have an understood subject, the subject is understood to be you. You do your homework. If you say, walk the dog, again, you is understood to be the subject of the sentence. Usually this happens with commands or requests. And if the subject is not written out in a sentence, it's understood to be you. In certain cases, just as you might have a compound predicate or compound verb, you might have multiple subjects or compound subjects. Elvis and I are going to the zoo. Who are going? Elvis and I. Two subjects. One of the more potentially confusing constructions that can be troublesome when you're looking for subjects and verbs are sentences that begin with the expletive there. Now, an expletive in this case just means a placeholder. The word there appears at the beginning of the sentence where you would usually expect the subject to be, but in cases where you have the expletive there at the beginning, it's functioning as a placeholder to indicate this is where the subject would normally be, but actually it's going to show up a little bit later on in the sentence. So let's take a look at an example. There exist many beasts in the jungle that would happily make me their dinner. Here we have the verb, and this is a situation where it's particularly useful to find the verb first, exist. Okay, who exists in this case? We look to the place we would normally expect the subject to be at the beginning, and we find there. We know there can't function as a subject, so we need to find it later in the sentence, after the verb. Who exists or what exists? Beasts. Beasts exist. It's worth noting that some instructors and even some handbooks would argue for avoiding a construction where the sentence begins with there. This is a perfectly acceptable option. So let's take a look at how you might recast the sentence about the beasts in the jungle. Many beasts in the jungle would happily make me their dinner. Here you have a more traditional order of the sentence, subject and verb. Avoiding sentences that start with there is an option, but again, it's not an absolute necessity. There's technically nothing grammatically incorrect about beginning a sentence with an expletive. And in some cases, you might find it's a nice option for varying the style and shaking up the way your sentences look throughout an essay. To review, a sentence has to have a complete subject and a complete verb. For example, looking at roadkill tends to disgust me. In this case, we have what sometimes a verb, looking, functioning as our subject, and our verb is tends. Again, your subject is who or what the sentence is about. The verb indicates the action of the subject, what the subject is doing, how the subject exists. And you have to have a subject and a verb in order to have a complete sentence. But a subject and a verb alone are not enough. You have to have a subject and a verb and a complete thought. Again, in order to have a complete sentence, subject, verb, complete thought. Complete sentence is also sometimes referred to as a main clause or an independent clause. An independent means it can stand on its own as a complete sentence. So to have a complete sentence, you must have all three components. So let's look at an example that has a subject and a verb, but it's lacking a complete thought. Looking at roadkill tends. Tends to what is the question? The reader's left hanging. We know that something else needs to be there, but we don't know what it is. So for instance, to make sense, you need to add the last part of the sentence. Looking at roadkill tends to disgust me. Now, while a subject and a verb might not always work together to create a complete thought, in some cases they do, and a subject and a verb might be enough. For instance, the shortest sentence in the Bible, Jesus wept. It's just a subject and a verb, but they work together to create a complete thought. You know who the subject is, you know exactly what the subject is doing. It's important also to note that there are a couple of different kinds of constructions that we talk about when we talk about sentences. We have phrases, and a phrase will have a subject or a verb, but not both. For instance, traipsing through the park is a phrase. We have traipsing, a verb, but we don't know who or what is traipsing. A clause will have both a subject and a verb, and there are two different kinds of clauses that it's important to keep in mind. An independent clause or a main clause, again, is a complete sentence. It has a subject, it has a verb, and it also makes a complete thought. Stuart tripped over a hedgehog. So Stuart is our subject, tripped is our verb. We know who Stuart is and what he did. A dependent clause or a subordinate clause also has a subject and a verb. A clause will always have both, but a dependent or subordinate clause is subordinate. It's dependent. It cannot stand on its own. So the subject and verb don't also have a complete thought. For instance, while Stuart was traipsing through the park. You can see that we need more information here to create a complete sentence. And in this example, we also have included what is sometimes called a subordinating conjunction, the word while. Subordinating conjunctions might or might not, in all cases, appear in a subordinate clause. But if you have a subordinating conjunction, the likelihood is almost 100% that you're going to have a subordinate clause. And there are words that can tip you off to let you know that this is the case. Some other examples of subordinating conjunctions are though, while, since, because, after. So remember, dependent clauses cannot stand on their own. They have a subject and a verb, but lack a complete thought. And an independent clause can stand on its own. Dependent clauses can't stand alone, and they have to go with that complete sentence in order to provide clarity. As an example, while Stuart was traipsing through the park, he tripped over a hedgehog. The main clause here is he tripped over a hedgehog. Tripped is our verb, he is our subject. At the beginning of the sentence, we have a dependent clause, which just gives us a little bit more information about the sentence. We know when it happened that Stuart tripped over this hedgehog, while he was traipsing through the park. Phrases and clauses are important to be aware of and to understand because you want to make sure that you don't just have a phrase or a subordinate clause because you want to be sure to avoid the dreaded sentence fragment. Sentence fragments are some people's least favorite sentence error, simply because they create confusion. Nothing will bring a reader up quicker and make them stop short as fast as a fragment. A fragment happens if a sentence is missing a subject, it's missing a verb, or it doesn't work to create a complete thought. So always make sure that you have all three of those components. Again, fragments are confusing. You don't want to make your reader work that hard, and if there's a fragment, they're often going to have to stop and work to fill in the gaps, even if they can kind of see where the writer of the sentence was going. The fragments that I most frequently see in writing are those that are a phrase or a subordinate clause without a complete sentence attached. So I've pulled a few examples from student papers, so let's take a look at those and see how fragments show up in the wild, so to speak. Family members are the people who know us the best, even some of the dark secrets that no one else should know. Now, in this case, we have a phrase as a fragment, and this is a pretty good example of the type of fragment that I see most often. You can probably see how these two ideas connect. We have a complete independent clause to begin with, and then this second part is a fragment, even some of the dark secrets that no one else should know. What about these dark secrets? Some of what the dark secrets, that's our subject. But if you'll notice, we don't have a verb. And the easiest fix for a fragment like this, and it's a perfect illustration of the adage, it wants to go with the previous sentence. And in most cases, the fragments, again, that I see in writing are those that want to go with the sentence immediately before them or the sentence immediately after them. So in this case, we can just insert a comma and attach the phrase. Family members are the people who know us the best, even some of the dark secrets that no one else should know. And this is a big improvement. The reader is able to see the connection and doesn't have to stop to parse it. Here's another example of a phrase as a fragment, but in this example we have a verb or verbs, but we don't have a subject. Everyone has an embarrassing moment at one point in time. Complete thought makes sense. This second part is where we have an issue. Maybe, for example, falling down the stairs, tripping over a trash can, or having words jumble up while talking in front of a crowd. Again, this is an excellent example of a phrase that simply wants to be joined to the previous sentence. Everyone has an embarrassing moment at one point in time. For example, falling down the stairs, tripping over a trash can, or having words jumble up while talking in front of a crowd. Simply joining this phrase to the previous complete sentence helps to clarify the meaning, the connection is more clear, and the reader doesn't have to stop and scratch his head. In addition to phrases, the other most common instance of fragments that I see are subordinate clauses, where you have that dependent clause that can't stand on its own, and it's trying desperately to be a complete sentence, but it's just not going to work. Remember, phrases are different from clauses in that clauses have a subject and a verb, whereas the phrase will only have one or the other. So let's take a look at an example from a student paper. She's thinking that if she doesn't find this pen, then her streak of good grades is going to go down the tube, though she isn't going to exactly fail the test if she doesn't have that one pen. In this case, notice we have a subject, she, and a verb, going. And the problem we run into with this sentence is the word though. Though is one of those subordinating conjunctions that lets the reader know that what comes after it can't stand on its own. If you got rid of though, you would actually have a complete sentence in this case. So one option for fixing this particular error would be simply to eliminate though and capitalize the S in she. She isn't going to exactly fail the test if she doesn't have that one pen. If, however, you want to more closely connect these clauses, leave the though in and it explains how the second clause is related to that first independent clause. She's thinking that if she doesn't find this pen, then her streak of good grades is going to go down the tube, though she isn't going to exactly fail the test if she doesn't have that one pen. As a quick cautionary note, again, it's always good to try to avoid fragments in writing because they can negatively impact the clarity of your writing. In some cases, if you're using Microsoft Word especially, the program will underline fragments or other errors or things that it thinks are errors in green. This can be very helpful, and if you see something underlined in green, it's probably worth taking a look at it and trying to figure out what's wrong. However, in spite of how helpful this feature is, you shouldn't allow it to become a crutch, because in some cases it makes mistakes. It's not always going to be right. I've seen Microsoft Word underline something and indicate it as a fragment, even though it was a complete sentence. So just something to be aware of. Proofread carefully, but don't rely solely on your computer programs, just as you wouldn't rely completely on spell check alone. So to recap some important ideas about sentences, phrases, and clauses. Complete sentences must have a subject, a verb, and a complete thought. A phrase will either have a subject or a verb, but not both. One or the other will be missing. A clause will have both a subject and a verb. But there are two kinds of clauses. An independent clause has a subject and a verb, as well as a complete thought. An independent clause is a complete sentence or a main clause and can stand on its own, hence independent. A dependent clause, however, also called a subordinate clause, cannot stand on its own. It will have a subject and a verb, but there will be no complete thought. And there may, in some cases, be some sort of signal word, such as a subordinating conjunction, that lets the reader know that what comes after it is a dependent clause. So remember to proofread carefully for fragments in your writing. Look for phrases on their own or clauses on their own that maybe want to go with another sentence close by. If you're worried that you might have some fragments in your writing that you're just missing, or if you have questions or unclear about anything related to subjects, verbs, phrases, and clauses, we would be more than happy to work with you at the Writing Center.